If you can fix them, I'll marry you. The audacious declaration from Seraphina Vance, the powerful headmistress of Ethelgard Conservatory, struck the desperate silence of the meeting room like a bolt of lightning. This was no proposal, but a reckless gamble. Her target wasn't a prince or a wealthy magnate, but Liam Sterling, the school's janitor, a widower with calloused hands and a mysterious past. To the witnesses, it was the deranged pronouncement of a woman broken by pressure. But for Seraphina and Liam, that moment was a fated pact, a desperate promise for an impossible miracle. When the challenge was made, no one could have guessed that it would not only decide the fate of a school on the brink of collapse, but also serve as the opening notes of a tragic symphony, one of dignity, love, and rebirth from the ashes. The air in the Ethelgard Conservatory's meeting room was thick, heavy enough to be cut with a knife. The faint scent of old oak and aged paper, a fragrance that once spoke of prestige and scholarship, now smelled more like a forgotten tomb. Headmistress Seraphina Vance sat ramrod straight in her chair, her hands clasped tightly on the polished table. It was the posture of authority, but a closer look would reveal her knuckles were white from clenching, and in her determined eyes, a deep weariness from sleepless nights lingered. Opposite her sat the board of directors, led by Mr. Alistair Finch, a sharp-witted investor in a perfectly tailored suit, with a professional yet utterly cold smile. The rustle of paper as he flipped through a document was a menacing sound in the oppressive silence. "Seraphina," Mr. Finch began, his voice as cold and precise as a scalpel. "Let's not beat around the bush. The numbers speak for themselves. We've lost 30% of our students this year, and our major sponsors are pulling out, one by one. Your classical is everything philosophy. Your father's legacy is outdated." Seraphina took a deep breath. "Art is not a commodity, Alistair. It doesn't follow trends. We train artists, not entertainers. Art doesn't pay the electricity bill." "Seraphina," Mr. Finch sneered, "the upcoming enrollment concert is our last chance. If it doesn't create a big enough splash, if we can't convince parents that this place has a future, then we will be forced to act. This school is an asset, and it's losing value every day." She knew she was on the defensive. Every word he spoke was like a hammer blow, shattering her last remaining efforts. Meanwhile, in the grand hallway just outside, another world existed. Liam Sterling pushed a vacuum cleaner, its droning hum the only sound that seemed to be loyal to him in the entire building. He vaguely heard the muffled argument through the oak door, words like outdated and pulling out reaching his ears. He didn't understand the full story, but he felt the tension. The school was sick. In a secluded corner, his daughter, little Lily, sat on a bench, her small legs swinging gently. She was lost in a worn-out picture book of knights and fire-breathing dragons, completely oblivious to the storm brewing just feet away. She was the reason Liam kept going, the single clear note in the cacophonous music of his life. The meeting room door suddenly swung open. A grim-faced piano teacher emerged, holding a paper coffee cup. As he passed Liam, he carelessly tossed the empty cup onto the floor where Liam had just finished cleaning. The last few drops of coffee splattered, creating an ugly brown stain. The man didn't say a word or stop for a second, acting as if Liam and his broom were just another piece of furniture, a walking trash can. Liam stopped the vacuum. He silently looked at the mess, then bent down to pick up the cup. His eyes held a familiar sadness, a sorrow of being invisible. He let out a sigh that no one heard, then resumed his work. In the main concert hall, Isolde Vance, Seraphina's daughter, was venting her frustration on a vintage Fazioli grand piano. Her fingers flew across the keys in a storm, playing a perfectly flawless Chopin piece, fast and precise like a programmed machine. Her technique was impeccable, a masterful performance that would make any teacher nod in approval. But the music was cold, devoid of warmth or a moment for the soul to breathe. It was a perfect attack of notes. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from the speakers. The sound system emitted a painful, grating shriek, like a wounded animal's cry, and then went completely silent. The stage lights flickered a few times before dying out, leaving only the weak daylight filtering through the high windows. "It's broken again?" Isolde yelled in frustration, the broken perfection more than she could stand. She slammed her hand down on the keys, creating a harsh, dissonant chord. "This school is falling apart." George, the school's elderly technician, rushed in. He had grey hair and shoulders slumped with weariness. He fumbled with a tangled mess of wires, his face showing a growing sense of helplessness. Finally, he shook his head. "The system is just too old, miss. The components are all overloaded. It's like trying to keep a dying old man alive. We'd have to replace the whole thing, and the budget." He trailed off, but everyone understood. That night, as Æthelgard sank into silence, only Liam and the echoes of emptiness remained. He pushed his cleaning cart into the empty concert hall. The vast space was peaceful under the silvery moonlight streaming through the windows. He looked at the open sound console, a chaotic mess of helplessness. He set his broom down and walked closer. His rough, calloused hands, hardened by his janitorial work, moved with surprising delicacy. He pulled a small toolkit from his pocket, its tools strangely shiny compared to his appearance. His hands moved over the circuit boards, not fumbling, but as if reading a familiar piece of music. He quickly removed a cover, revealing a burnt-out chip. He carefully took it out, replaced it with a small component he always carried with him, and then used a mini soldering iron to fix a loose connection that George had missed. His hands were steady, without a single tremor. He tried the switch. A gentle blue light appeared on the console. The speakers were no longer silent. A soft, clean hum filled the air, like the breath of a giant just awakened from a long sleep. He turned a volume knob, and a clear, warm test tone sounded. Liam smiled fleetingly, a rare and private smile just for himself. He quickly closed the console, put away his tools, then picked up his broom and continued cleaning, as if the miracle had never happened. The next morning, George reported to Serafina that the sound system had magically fixed itself. Amid her many worries about the board meeting, she merely shrugged. "It must have just been a temporary glitch. A lucky break, I suppose." She quickly dismissed it from her mind, unaware that a quiet note of hope had just been played by the invisible man who was still cleaning the hallway outside her office. The pre-dawn sky was a soft lavender, peeking through the high windows of the concert hall and promising a new day. For Liam, this was the most precious time. The school was still asleep, free of judgmental glances and careless words. There was only him, the silence, and the echoes of 1,000 great symphonies once played there. Now, for these few hours, he could truly belong. He pushed his cleaning cart into the hall, but today, his eyes didn't focus on the dirt on the floor. They were drawn to the vintage Fazioli piano, standing majestically on the stage like a sleeping king. Its glossy black finish reflected the first rays of light, an irresistible invitation. He couldn't resist. It was a craving, a longing that had been suppressed for too long. He walked slowly onto the stage, each step echoing in the silent space. He sat on the worn leather bench, feeling the cool touch of the ivory keys under his hands, calloused from cleaning chemicals. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and let the smell of old wood and the crisp morning air fill his lungs. Then he let his fingers go, allowing them to tell the story he had never dared to voice. An improvised jazz melody began, not a noisy tune, but a gentle flow, at times as melancholic as a confession, at others soaring with hope. It started with poignant chords, tinged with the pain of loss. Then the melody became more playful, like a child's innocent laughter. It told of a lost love, of his wife's smile he could now only see in dreams, of the burden of a single father trying to mend a broken world, and of the dreams of performing on a grand stage that were buried under the dust of life. The melody had a fierce vitality, a soul that was sobbing and yearning to be heard. "What are you doing on my piano?" Isolde's icy voice cut the music short, like a broken string. Liam jolted, his eyes flying open. His hands froze on the keys. The young woman stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her eyes full of judgment. Her expensive practice clothes were a stark contrast to his faded janitor's uniform. Isolde had been stunned when she heard the music. She had arrived early to practice, but the sound had stopped her at the door. She had never heard music so alive. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes a note would be out of place, but it was genuine. It touched a deep place in her soul that her own flawless technique could never reach. But that brief moment of emotion was quickly replaced by anger. This piano was hers, a symbol of her talent and status, something her parents had paid a fortune for her to own. What right did a janitor have to touch it? "I'm sorry, miss. I was just..." Liam scrambled to his feet, feeling like a child caught doing something wrong. His face burned with shame. "Just what?" Isolde advanced, her shoes tapping crisply on the wooden floor. Each step felt like it was trampling on his self-respect. "This is a place for artists, not janitors. You've made my piano dirty. Go back to your broom." The words, sharp as broken glass, pierced Liam's heart. He said nothing, just bowed his head, slipped past her, and walked out, leaving his cleaning cart behind in the middle of the room. His slumped shoulders seemed heavier than usual. Isolde's words were not just an insult. They were a cruel reminder of the chasm between the man he was and the man he had once dreamed of becoming. That evening, in their small, humble apartment, Lily found her father sitting silently by the window, staring out at the city lights. Dinner was untouched on the table. She knew something was wrong. She tiptoed over and wrapped her small arms around his neck from behind, burying her head in his broad back. "Don't be sad, Dad," she whispered. "I know your music has a heart. One day, they'll hear it." Liam turned and hugged his little daughter, his only source of life. The smell of her kid shampoo soothed the pain in his heart. He could endure contempt, but he couldn't let the world trample the only things he had left: the music in his soul and his daughter's faith in him. A quiet determination shone in his eyes. Meanwhile, in the silent concert hall, Isolde sat before the Fazioli piano. She tried to play her Chopin piece again, striving to recapture the perfection, the control, but Liam's jazz melody haunted her, lingering in her mind like a ghost. Her notes, though precise, sounded soulless. She felt a terrifying emptiness. Frustrated, she slammed her hands down on the keys, creating a jarring, out-of-place chord. For the first time in her life, she felt her music was a lie. A seed of doubt had been planted. Was the perfection she always chased just a cage for her soul? And did the janitor she had just scorned possess the one thing she craved most? A soul that could sing. She looked down at her hands, then at the empty space where Liam had stood. A strange mix of guilt and curiosity began to creep into her mind. The crisis struck without warning, merciless and unstoppable. With only 3 days left until the enrollment concert, the final lifeline for the Æthelgard Conservatory, the air in the school was already taut. Every teacher, every student felt the invisible pressure, and then the strings snapped. A small but deafening pop, like a light bulb bursting, echoed from the technical control room. It was followed by a deathly silence. In the concert hall, everything plunged into darkness. The lights flickered a few times and then went out completely. The sound system emitted a long, drawn-out hiss and then went mute. Worse still, the Fazioli piano, with its complex internal electronic sensors, was also completely crippled. This was no minor glitch. It was a catastrophic and total system collapse. The bad news spread like wildfire. An emergency board meeting was called immediately. This time, the atmosphere in the room wasn't one of warning, but of judgment. Mr. Finch slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing like a final gunshot. His face was cold, stripped of its usual courtesy. "That's it, Serafina. Do you hear me? This is the last straw. An unacceptable disgrace." Mr. Finch slammed his hand down, his voice sounding like a final gunshot. Serafina's face was pale, but she tried to keep her voice steady. "Alistair, This is an accident. Accidents can happen anywhere. An accident? Another board member, Miss Gable, scoffed. Or is it gross mismanagement? We warned you about the outdated facilities months ago. What did you do? Spent all our money on inviting some old European cellists to teach. That was an investment in artistic quality, Serafina retorted, her voice rising. This school was built on a foundation of art, not flashy light bulbs. Art can't exist in the dark, Serafina. Mr. Finch interrupted. Don't you understand? We've lost all credibility. Cancel the performance immediately. We can't let potential parents and sponsors come here and witness this circus of failure. No. Serafina shot to her feet. The concert will go on. I've called the best engineers in the city. They are on their way. However, her hope was quickly extinguished. The engineers, top experts, came and went, each with a look of dismay. They looked at the charred wires and examined the complex circuit boards before shaking their heads. This system is a chaotic mix of old and new, patched together over many years, the lead engineer concluded. An electrical surge short-circuited everything. To find the root of the problem, untangle the mess, and fix it in 3 days is impossible. We are very sorry, Miss Vance, but this is an impossible task. The conclusion was a death sentence. Mr. Finch stood up, adjusted his tie, and his face was triumphant. You heard them, Serafina. Impossible. The meeting is over. Tomorrow, we will begin the process of finding a buyer for this school. At least we can salvage some value from the property. Serafina collapsed into a chair, all strength drained from her body. Her father's dream, her family's legacy, was about to vanish before her eyes. She looked around the room, seeing only pity or, worse, a look of satisfaction from Mr. Finch's side. She had lost. Just then, there was a knock at the door, a gentle, almost hesitant knock, yet it rang out clearly in the heavy silence. The door creaked open, and Liam stepped in, still in his grey janitor's uniform. He had heard everything from the hallway, where he had been pretending to clean. What do you want? Mr. Finch snapped, annoyed by the interruption. Liam didn't look at him. He looked directly at Serafina, at the woman who sat there, broken and helpless. Headmistress, he said, his voice calm but resolute, a strange tranquility amid the chaos. I can fix them. The entire room went silent for a second, then erupted in laughter. It wasn't a cheerful laugh, but a bitter, cynical one, full of mockery. A janitor, fix something that top engineers had given up on. What a ridiculous joke. Mr. Peterson, the senior piano teacher, who always looked down on anything outside the academic world, spoke up sarcastically, his voice full of condescension. Mr. Sterling, what are you talking about? If you can fix this, I'll quit my job and call you maestro. A mix of rage and utter desperation suddenly swelled within Serafina. The mockery of everyone, her own failure, and this janitor's absurd appearance. It all combined into an explosive emotion. She had nothing left to lose. She shot to her feet, her chair toppling over. Her eyes blazed as she looked directly at Liam, not as a headmistress, but as a dethroned queen placing her final bet. Her voice hardened, echoing through the room, not a jest but a bitter challenge, the mad gamble of a person backed into a corner. She pointed at Liam, her voice cutting through all the murmurs. Fine, you say you can fix them, right? Listen closely, everyone. If you can fix them, I'll marry you. The entire meeting room fell into a stunned silence. The laughter stopped, replaced by a suffocating quiet. The challenge was too insane, too absurd. Everyone thought the headmistress had truly lost her mind. It was no longer an abstract saving the school, but a direct pact. You do the impossible, and I will do the unthinkable. Liam didn't flinch. He looked straight into her eyes, seeing the desperation and the faint glimmer of hope within them. He didn't hear a marriage proposal. He heard an opportunity to prove himself, to reclaim his dignity, an opportunity for his daughter to be proud. He nodded decisively, his voice steady. "I accept." Outside, Isolde had heard everything. She stood frozen, leaning against the wall to keep from collapsing. Her mind was in turmoil. The janitor she had disdained was now her mother's only hope, and the hope of the entire school. And that insane challenge. It echoed in her mind, a dissonant chord, signaling an unpredictable change. Serafina's challenge had turned Liam's dusty storage room into the beating heart of the conservatory. This space, which once only held old mops and chemical cleaning supplies, had been transformed into a laboratory, a miniature workshop. The scent of machine oil and hot solder intertwined, creating an atmosphere of urgent labor, a scent of fragile hope. Under the faint yellow light of a single overhead bulb, Liam worked like an artist in the throes of creation. Hand-drawn circuit diagrams covered with a mess of notes were tacked to the wall, looking as intricate as a Beethoven symphony score. Electronic components, some salvaged from old equipment, others cleverly crafted by him, were strewn across his rickety workbench. He wasn't just repairing, he was reinventing. His calloused hands moved with the precision of an engineer and the sensitivity of a musician. He was combining modern chips with vintage audio amplifiers, not by following a textbook, but by listening. The school's engineers, who had initially come to watch the spectacle and witness the inevitable failure, now stood quietly in a corner. The mockery on their faces had vanished, replaced by undisguised awe. "How do you know how to optimize this vintage amplifier with a modern processing chip?" A young engineer, who had tried and failed miserably, couldn't help but ask. "We tried it. It causes terrible signal interference. The technical specifications are completely incompatible." Liam didn't look up, his hands meticulously soldering a connection as thin as a hair. "Because you listen with a meter, with numbers on a screen," he said, his voice even. "I listen with my ears. It's crying out at this frequency. You see the interference as an enemy and try to eliminate it, while I find a way to make it part of the music." They fell silent. The statement, simple yet profound, opened up a new horizon in their thinking. From that day on, they no longer came to watch a spectacle. They began to stay, helping him organize tools, search for components, and learn in silence from the janitor they had once looked down upon. Late one evening, when Ethelgard was deep in sleep, the door to the storage room creaked open. The light from the hallway cast a long shadow. Isolde stepped inside, carrying a still-warm container of food and a large thermos of coffee. The rich aroma of coffee filled the air, overpowering the smell of machine oil. She said nothing, just placed them on a vacant corner of the workbench and sat down on an old chair, silently observing. Liam looked up, slightly surprised, but didn't stop working. He gave a small nod in thanks. The silence between them stretched on, broken only by the soft taps of the soldering iron. Finally, it was Isolde who spoke, her voice a little hesitant, completely unlike her usual haughty tone. "That music. The other day in the concert hall. Why did it sound so different?" Liam stopped. He put down the soldering iron and looked up at her. This was the first time she had looked him directly in the eye without judgment. He saw not just curiosity in her gaze, but also a certain confusion. "Because it didn't come from notes written on paper," he said softly. "It came from here." He pointed to his heart. "It's the story of my lost wife, of my daughter, of the dreams I had to give up. Your music is perfect, Isolde, terrifyingly perfect. But where is your story?" The question was like an arrow, piercing Isolde's soul. She bowed her head, looking down at her hands, the hands of a masterful pianist. She had always been taught to play the right notes, the right rhythm, the right technique. Her mother, her teachers, they all demanded perfection. No one had ever asked her about her story, perhaps because she didn't even know what her story was. She said nothing more, just quietly stood up and left, leaving the food and coffee behind. But something had shifted. The next morning, Isolde walked into her mother's office. Serafina looked years older after a few sleepless nights, staring blankly out the window. "Mom," Isolde said, her voice resolute, "trust him, just this once." Serafina turned, surprised to see her daughter. "What are you saying, Isolde? You, of all people, disliked him the most." "I don't know," Isolde confessed, "but I have a feeling he can do it. I heard him play the piano. That music, it has a soul." Her daughter's words, especially from Isolde, who was always so critical, combined with her own bottomless desperation, led Serafina to make a final decision. She had nothing left to lose. She found Liam in the storage room. He looked exhausted, his face covered in a stubble, but his eyes shone with a fiery focus. She placed the master key to the concert hall on the table. "This whole school is in your hands, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice filled with a sense of surrender, without a trace of sarcasm. "Don't let me down." Liam looked at the key, then up at her. He gave a firm nod, not a promise, but a pledge that contained everything. It was an all-or-nothing gamble, a wager in which the future of Ethelgard and Serafina's honor were placed in the hands of a janitor. But now, she no longer felt alone. An unexpected alliance had been forged in silence, connected by the smell of coffee, a question about a story, and a fragile belief in the impossible. The day of the fated performance finally arrived. The air outside the Ethelgard Conservatory was bustling with luxury cars lining the street, but inside the auditorium it felt as heavy as a funeral. The crystal chandeliers, despite having been repaired by Liam to shine brightly, couldn't seem to dispel the atmosphere of skepticism and morbid curiosity. Most people were there not to enjoy music, but to witness the fall of a legend, to have something to talk about at future dinner parties. Mr. Finch sat in the front row, a place of honor, his expression triumphant as he occasionally glanced at the gold watch on his wrist. He was waiting for his moment of victory, for the velvet curtain to rise and reveal a silent stage. Backstage, the tension was even thicker. Students paced restlessly, adjusting their outfits. Serafina stood motionless in the shadows, her hands clasped tightly, icy cold. She had gambled everything, and now all she could do was wait. Just as the MC was about to walk onto the stage, Isolde, in a magnificent evening gown, suddenly raised her hand to stop him. She walked over to her mother. "Mom, I'll do it," she whispered. Serafina looked at her daughter, surprised but also full of trust. She nodded. Isolde took a deep breath, then stepped into the spotlight. The entire hall fell silent, waiting for the young pianist's performance. But she didn't walk toward the piano. She went straight to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her clear and steady voice echoing throughout the hall. "Before the official program begins, we would like to introduce a special guest and our technical director for tonight, Mr. Liam Sterling." The audience exchanged bewildered glances. The name was completely foreign. A few whispers broke out. "Who is Liam Sterling? Technical director, Mr." Finch frowned, feeling that something was wrong, and then, from the wings, Liam walked out. He wasn't wearing a suit or a tie. He was in his grey janitor's uniform, the cleanest and most ironed one he owned. He stepped onto the stage to the stunned silence of hundreds of people. He looked small and out of place under the bright stage lights, like a misplaced note in a grand symphony. He didn't sit down at the piano right away. He walked over to the sound console positioned on one side of the stage, a spot no artist had ever stood before. He held a small, self-made device that looked like a simple remote with a few buttons. He pressed the first button. A symphony of light and electronic sound suddenly erupted. The stage lighting system, which he had completely reprogrammed, no longer lit the stage monotonously. The lights danced, blending with each note, sometimes creating a gentle blue like a serene lake, and other times erupting in a fiery red. The surround sound, clear and powerful, filled the hall, enveloping every audience member. This was not a repaired sound, it was a reborn sound. A few people in the audience, those knowledgeable about technology, watched with their mouths agape in astonishment. After this impressive and unexpected prelude, As the entire hall was still in awe, Liam slowly walked to the Fazioli piano. He sat down and placed his calloused hands on the keys. The music began. It was no longer the sound of an old instrument, but the song of a soul that had just been awakened. The sound was pristine, powerful, and full of emotion. He played an improvised piece, a miraculous and unprecedented blend of jazz, classical, and the electronic sounds he had just created. The melody told his own story, and the story of the school, a journey from ruin, through pain and despair, to a glorious rebirth from the ashes. The notes were at times poignant, at times powerful, and at others as gentle as a whisper. For a moment, the audience no longer saw a janitor. They saw an artist, a true artist. The entire hall held its breath. All skepticism, all mockery had vanished, leaving only the music. When Liam's final note faded into the air, an absolute, emotion-filled silence lingered for a few seconds. Then, one person stood up to applaud. Then 2, then 10, and then the entire hall erupted in a thunderous, passionate, and heartfelt standing ovation. Everyone was on their feet, their cheers echoing. Even Mr. Finch had to stand up, his face changing from triumph to utter astonishment, and finally to a reluctant acknowledgement. He had lost. In the wings, Serafina stood with her hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. They weren't tears of relief, but of profound wonder and gratitude. A miracle had truly happened. It didn't come from a deity. It came from the hands and heart of a quiet janitor. Before the thunderous applause had subsided, while the audience was still immersed in an emotional musical high, Serafina emerged from the wings. She was no longer a headmistress trying to appear strong. She walked with a light step, her face tear-streaked but radiant with a pure happiness. She stood next to Liam, the man who was still bewildered by the warm reception, his eyes still holding the trace of sadness from the piece he had just played. Serafina took the microphone from Isolde's hand. She took a deep breath to compose herself, her voice trembling with emotion but clear throughout the hall. She began, placing a hand gently on Liam's shoulder, didn't just repair the machines, he repaired our faith. He taught us all a valuable lesson. True talent is not found in the clothes you wear, not in the diplomas on the wall, but in your heart and your hands. She turned toward the board of directors, where Mr. Finch stood frozen, his face stripped of all self-satisfaction. Therefore, I, as the headmistress of Ethelgard Conservatory, propose the appointment of Mr. Liam Sterling as the head of music and creative technology, a new department that will be the heart and future of this school. The bold proposal was met with an even louder round of applause, a warm and undeniable consensus. The board members looked at each other and nodded. They knew that after tonight, no one could deny this man's talent and vision. Then, as the applause began to die down, before the eyes of hundreds of curious people, Serafina turned to look at Liam. Her gaze was no longer that of a powerful headmistress, but of a woman looking at the man who had saved everything for her, with deep admiration and gratitude. A genuine smile, perhaps for the first time in many years, graced her lips. "And, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice softer, more private, despite being on stage, "a promise is a promise." The entire hall held its breath. The insane challenge from that day's meeting had been whispered among a few. "But I think," she continued, a mischievous twinkle in her eyes, "we could start with dinner first, couldn't we?" The subtle and graceful suggestion broke the tension. A few light laughs rippled through the audience. Liam, who had been tense for days, finally smiled back. It was a warm and confident smile, the smile of a man who had found himself again. "I would be delighted, headmistress." The performance ended, but a new dawn had truly begun. The Ethelgard Conservatory was not just saved, it was reborn. That very evening, Isolde was the first to approach Liam backstage, bowing her head and saying, "Maestro, may I be the first student to enroll in the new department?" Liam looked at the young woman who had once insulted him and nodded, without a trace of resentment. From the audience, a small figure ran onto the stage. Lily hugged her father, her eyes sparkling with immense pride. "I knew it. I knew they would hear your music." Liam bent down and held his daughter tight, burying his face in her soft hair. This was his greatest reward. In the final scene, as the hall emptied and the staff began to clean up, Serafina and Liam stood together on the empty stage. The single remaining spotlight shone on them, creating a warm circle of light. Behind them, the Fazioli piano and the sound system glowed like stars in the night. Two people from two completely different worlds, one at the top of society and the other at the bottom, now shared a single rhythm. They stood there in silence, no more words needed, ready to write a new symphony together, not just for the school, but for their own lives.